Hello and welcome to the Equals Math Transition webinar. The purpose of this training is to introduce the transition lessons that accompany the Equals Math curriculum. If you have any questions after our webinar today, please reach out to the customer service team at AbleNet. Let's get started. Equals Transition Math is a set of real-world application math lessons and student materials. These lessons are ordered and placed after Equals Math lessons to assure prerequisite math skills from Equals Math are taught prior to the transition math lessons. These are designed to be companion lessons to specific Equals Math curriculum objectives and can be incorporated into your Equals Math schedule. The lesson structure is specifically designed for application of learned math skills from Equals Math to the community by focusing on community living at home and neighborhood with access to retail and restaurant locations, recreation, transportation, employment, as well as post-secondary education environments. During Equals Transition lessons, students learn how to research their own community, interview workers, and present information they have learned. Each lesson includes typical transition soft skills such as promoting self-advocacy by identifying and expressing personal preferences, making choices, safely seeking assistance, and following step-by-step directions. The transition lessons are available within the additional members-only content. It is recommended to request the most up-to-date members-only content by using the link on the slide. During our research, we found common threads that are included when transition planning and supporting math concepts students are learning. These include self-determination, advocacy, communication, and independent living skills. During transition planning, students are asked about their skills in each of these areas. So for self-determination, it's making choices, identifying interests, strengths, weaknesses, believing in oneself. For advocacy, it's weighing options and the knowledge of rights. Communication is taking part in a discussion, an expression of thoughts and feelings, as well as that collaboration with others. And finally, for independent living skills, it's managing daily life, including schedules. As we go through the materials, keep these process areas in mind so that you can really see how they are represented within the lessons. When teaching Equals Transition lessons, note that the lesson activities are structured similar to Equals Math. As you begin to read through a lesson, it should feel familiar, especially if you have been teaching Equals Math all year. Activities on pages 1 and 3 are basically the same type of activities within Equals. So you're activating and building background knowledge, vocabulary, strategy and math tool instruction, followed by a community research page, and finally, problem solving. The materials for transition lessons are located within the additional members-only content and are organized by corresponding Equals chapters and lessons. Printable materials from Equals Transition and templates for use with Equals manipulatives, as you can see here with the blocks to represent groceries. In addition to transition lessons and printable materials found on members only, you may also use some printed materials from the Equals Content Kit box, such as cards, solve posters, student tools, and work mats. Overall, this should really feel like an extension of an Equals Math lesson, which was our intention. So we're first going to discuss how to select a transition lesson. It is important to know that identifying which transition lesson to begin with is based on a student's current Equals placement. Equals Math should still be your primary math lesson. However, within a chapter, there are certain Equals lessons that have a transition lesson tied to it as a way for students to see that math concept from a transition lens. So in this example here, within chapter 4, there are 4 Equals Math lessons that have transition lessons tied to them. The Equals lessons should be taught first Then the transition lesson can be used to apply that skill to a transition point of view. Transition lessons are located in your equals members only digital content or within your additional members only digital content, depending on when you accessed members only. Transition materials are organized into a folder labeled equals transition math. Lessons and lesson materials are organized within chapter folders. Additional supports are also organized into your equals transition math introduction. There's a folder for posters, resources, and student cards. Those are all digital materials and will be called out specifically within lessons. You do want to set aside some time to go through these folders and read the introduction prior to teaching any transition lesson. The first step when teaching equals transition lessons is to identify which lesson to begin with. There are two spreadsheets showing different views of the transition lesson order. Both list the equals math lesson objective and the linked equals transition math lessons. Both spreadsheets are located within the resources folder. Taking a closer look at the spreadsheets now. The first is the equals transition money and budget spreadsheet. This shows the complete list of transition lesson objectives on the right with the specifically linked equals lessons on the left. This is a quick look at which equals lessons correspond to transition lessons. In this example, I can see that the equals lesson 1B1 is the required prerequisite for the transition lesson M1 or Money 1. Now notice there is a gap between the transition lessons. The next equals lesson 1B9 has two transition lessons associated with it and must be taught prior to the transition lessons M2 and M3. That does mean that every lesson from 1B1 to 1B8 must also be taught, as those lessons too are considered prerequisites to 1B9 and the following transition lessons. So the order of the lesson would go like this. I would start with equals lesson 1B1, move on to transition lesson M1. I'd then move back to equals lessons 1B2, 1B3, 1B4, 5, 6, 7, and 1B8. I would teach 1B9, then I could hop into my transition lessons M2 and M3. 1B9 is the last lesson in section B. The next time we see a transition lesson in chapter 1 is 1C12. All equals lessons leading up to 1C12 must be taught before M4, M5, M6, and M7 to ensure that the appropriate equals lesson order and, most importantly, those prerequisites are included in the student's background knowledge. You can see that the next equals lesson after 1C12 that has an associated equals transition lesson is 2B4. This means that I must teach all of the remaining lessons in chapter 1, 2A, plus 2B1 through 2B4 before I can move on to the transition lesson M8. When transition lessons are organized in a large block, like in this example here, you can also choose to spread those transition lessons out over multiple equals lessons. For example, after I teach transition lesson M4, I could decide to teach the next equals lesson 1C13. Then I could move on to transition lesson M5 and so on. As long as the equals lesson and the transition lesson order is maintained together and separately, it would not be advised to skip 1C12 to teach M4 first, for example. The second spreadsheet view you can use is the equals and equals transition money and budget lesson objective spreadsheet. This view shows all of the lesson objectives within equals, as well as all of the corresponding transition lessons. When you look at this document, you can see there is not a transition lesson for every equals lesson. However, You can use this spreadsheet to look back at previous transition lessons that are linked to equals lessons that students may have already been taught and see if it would be beneficial to your students to begin teaching those transition lessons first. Understand that you can go back to any transition lesson. However, you must make sure it is a previously taught equals lesson or a lesson that is prior to where they are placed in equals. In this example, the equals lesson on the left is associated with two transition lessons on the right. It would be expected that the equals lesson for D9 would be taught first, then the transition lesson M23, then M24. Looking at the materials now for transition lessons, there are two sets of materials that are required to implement the equals transition math lessons. The first are your equals lessons, your equals card set, your equals work mats, student tools, content posters, and manipulative kit materials. The second set of materials are your equals transition lessons, student tools, the transition card, card sets, and transition theme posters. All transition lesson materials are provided in a PDF format within your additional members only content. Some material can be printed or displayed digitally with a projector or an interactive board, PowerPoint, or iPad. Equals transition comes to utilize familiar student supports found in the equals curriculum. Lessons will require manipulatives from the equals kit, and student actions can be supported with the action dictionary. Leveled supports can also be found on various student materials. All of the print materials you may need for a transition lesson is organized into a single PDF document. Once you know the lesson you plan on teaching, locate that lesson within the chapter folder, open the lesson-specific document to print. The student material document you open and print are materials you will use for all 3 pages of a transition lesson. These printable materials are labeled with the transition lesson along the top and the name of the resource along the bottom. The included materials are: the first few pages are your lesson pick symbols. These are meant to be used to support communication and writing during the lessons. Now notice along the bottom, it shows the title vocab pick symbol and then the lesson. In addition to the lesson pick symbols, you will find a leveled I can page for each lesson. Each is labeled with the level and the title I can. There are also leveled concrete connection directions that are used during the vocabulary activities on page 1 of the transition lesson. To support page 2 activities, there are leveled research guides, as well as an interview form with pick symbols to complete. Leveled research fact and summary pages, also with pick symbols included. And problem-solving materials include the role play problem-solving page, as well as problem-solving recording worksheets. And finally, there's an independent survey. Lesson activities will clearly list which materials are needed for each activity. To access the transition cards, locate the student cards folder. Within this folder, there are 2 PDF documents, one with the transition specific vocabulary and the other transition lesson specific action cards. Transition lessons include a new set of vocabulary cards and action cards. These are digital, so you can present them on a smartboard, iPad, tablet, or bring them out as needed. As with the equals lessons, transition lessons call out the vocabulary and action cards that are needed for the lesson. Transition lessons use a combination of transition-specific vocabulary and action cards that are found within your PDF document, as well as the vocabulary and action cards from your equals content card set. To know which vocabulary and action cards are needed for the lessons, you'll use the spreadsheet that's found within the resources folder. The equals vocabulary and action word spreadsheet shows the vocabulary and action cards that are needed for each transition lesson. Now, this is a very useful guide to know which cards to use for each transition lesson. This is an Excel document called the Transition Vocabulary Action Words by Lesson document. This is one that I recommend printing prior to teaching lessons so you know which vocabulary cards and which action cards are used, and also where you can locate them. So in this example for M24, the review vocabulary word is difference, and it is a card that is found within your equals content card set. Notice where it says location, it is labeled as equals. So that would tell me it is found within my equals card set. The new vocabulary word is compare prices. This is a transition specific vocabulary word. Notice for location, it is labeled as equals transition. This tells me that I will locate this vocabulary word within the vocabulary PDF. For the action cards for M24, when I look at the 3 action cards that I will use for review, place, cover, compare, those are all action words that will be found within the equals content card set. Same for the new action cards, compare, count, identify. Those are also the equals content card set for my action cards. The transition posters have been created specific to the transition lesson objectives. So these are located within the poster folder. Each poster is a PDF document and it is labeled with the specific theme. That theme is labeled in the lesson, so you will clearly be able to identify it within the transition poster folder. Equals transition includes 28 theme posters. Poster locations such as a clothing store, fast food restaurant, and fitness center, just to name a few, provide a real-world connection to the lesson objectives that students are learning. You have the option of printing these resources, but know that they were really intended to be used digitally on a smartboard or presented on a screen or a tablet. So these posters are all in that PDF document to be viewed on a variety of platforms that's suitable for your classroom. Finally, the transition lessons are located within the chapter-specific folder within a single PDF document for that chapter. So once you know which chapter you are teaching from and have identified the transition lesson you plan on beginning with, you can decide to print that lesson for the entire chapter or a single lesson. Now that we have reviewed the materials, let's take a look at a transition lesson. The equals transition lesson structure is based on instructional practices from equals math and include activities to connect math to the real world. Transition lessons provide an opportunity for you to connect the math you teach to a transition lens. It is for that reason that prior to teaching a transition lesson, you make sure the content taught within that transition lesson is familiar. This means that you should have taught equals lesson associated with it prior to teaching the transition lesson, or the transition lesson is from an earlier chapter from where the student is currently placed in the curriculum. For example, let's say the student is currently learning in an equals chapter 3 lesson. I can decide to teach any transition lesson from chapters 1 or 2. A transition lesson is 3 pages in length. On page 1, students take what was learned in the equals math lesson or previous transition lesson and review the vocabulary and math tools connected to the transition objective. They review a related concept taught in a previous lesson and learn about tools and strategies introduced in the transition lesson. On page 2, students learn how to research their own community, interview workers, and present information. On page 3, students apply what they are learning from a problem-solving point of view. There's a role-playing opportunity, then an independent problem-solving opportunity. Transition lessons are meant to take place over the course of 1 to 2 weeks, depending on your student. The transition lesson we'll discuss today is M24. Now, remaining consistent with the equals math lessons, the lesson objective and material lists are located along the top of every lesson page. The identifier on the right shows not only the prerequisite equals lesson, but also the transition lesson identifier. In this example, this transition lesson is aligned to the equals lesson 4D9 and is the transition lesson M24. This is present at the top of all 3 pages. The lesson objective, compare differences between 3 prices up to $10 using whole dollar amounts for the exact same items from 3 stores to determine the best deal, is also listed along the top of every page. As with equals, read through the activity to know which material you will need. The materials list is at the top and is organized by the parts of the lesson page. The materials needed for each activity are listed within that first line of an activity for quick identification. Purple words still represent student action words, and the adaptations from the action dictionary are used to support students who may not complete those actions in a typical way. Prior to teaching M24, the concepts in the equals lesson 4D9 with the objective solve, compare, difference, unknown problems 0 to 10, and the transition lesson M23 with the objective identify regular and sale prices up to $10 in whole numbers and compare differences need to be previously taught. In 4D9, students learn the vocabulary word difference, and they learn how to compare amounts using WorkMat 17 with objects representing amounts to 10. In transition lesson M23, students learn the vocabulary word sale price and regular price, and they learn how to compare prices using WorkMat 17, but instead of objects, they're using dollar bill amounts. This is a prerequisite skill, and it is important to support students' understanding with the lesson objective M24, as students are asked to compare price differences from 3 different stores to identify the best deal. Created store ads are used during this lesson to give students that practice in comparing prices. The action cards and the action dictionary are a consistent support from the equals math curriculum. Both should be used during transition lessons to support communication and student accessibility during lessons. In line with equals, each lesson begins with a vocabulary and action word review. This activity is meant to feel like a review for students as they are reviewing a previously taught vocabulary word. Now, how this activity differs from the equals lesson is that students are encouraged to create their own concrete connection for this review word, and they're supported with the concrete directions at 3 levels. During equals math lessons, students may have helped in creating the concrete connection for this particular word, but during the transition lessons, students now are asked to follow written and illustrated directions in creating their own concrete connection. At a level 1, the concrete directions are pick symbol supported, and there's 1 step per page. Level 2 still has pick symbol supports, but all of the steps are found on 1 page. Level 3 does not have pick symbol supports and lists the steps on the page. This is perfect for students who are working on following step-by-step directions when completing a task. Once they have created the concrete connection, they use the pick symbols to identify the vocabulary word as a word they know on their I Can page. This is an example of the I Can pages. The I Can pages, along with the lesson pick symbols, are materials that are meant to be used in every lesson to support students' advocacy, self-determination, and communication. Students use what they have been learning during the lesson to answer the statements, words I know, tools I used, and I learned how to use these tools too. This is an important skill that supports students as they begin to gain their independence with their learning, and most importantly, communicating what they know. This skill is incredibly helpful when they identify their strengths and their preferences. The I Can pages are listed in specific activities for students to complete to show their learning. The next activity is concept review. Concept review provides a review of the equals objective the transition lesson is based on. So students review and explore math tools and problem-solving strategies that have been used in that lesson. During this part of the transition lesson, students are reviewing a tool or a strategy that is directly connected to the transition lesson. So in this example, we're practicing again with WorkMat 17 or the number line, and it's reviewed as a tool that we can use to compare amounts. In What I Need to Know, this introduces the new action words and vocabulary words tied to the transition lesson. Students work with the group to build a concrete connection for the new vocabulary word now. In this example, the concrete connection for the word compare prices is made. So once the concrete connection is created, the problem-solving strategies that students will use in this lesson are shown. This is a modeling opportunity for teachers to review familiar materials and also give students a chance to show what they know about these tools from previous lessons. The next activity is solve it together. So there's a problem listed within the lesson, and it's meant to be solved as a whole group. A theme poster is used to provide a context of where this transition objective may be used. So in this example, the grocery store theme poster is used as a way to provide students with an idea of where they might use the skill comparing different amounts. The store ads listed as materials in this activity can also be used to support the problem. After the problem is read aloud, the solve poster and the listed materials are used to work as a group to solve the problem. Guide students as needed through the solve poster steps and strategies. This activity is a time for students to show what they know about the tools and strategies that have been introduced and taught in previous lessons. Be sure to give students time to try out each listed strategy. After the problem is solved, the I Can page and corresponding pick symbols are used for students to show what they know about the tool and strategies from the lesson. On the second page of the lesson, students begin to explore the transition lesson from a research point of view. When you think about research and how we use research, we really view it as a tool. If we have a question or if we want to learn about a new product, we use the internet, we ask other people. If we have a question at work, we ask our colleagues. These are all skills that we have picked up over our school years and into our adulthood. Students with disabilities need practice with developing meaning behind what it means to research and the variety of ways that we can research out in the real world when there's no longer a teacher in the front of the classroom. The second page gives students a chance to learn what it means to research using a variety of tools, providing students with the opportunity to practice gathering information about their community or jobs, supporting students in developing their own opinions about the stores or jobs they like or dislike. This part of the lesson reinforces the transition process areas of self-determination and independent living skills. To complete research, students are asked to use the internet, photos, virtual or live tours, community visits, books, or even through interviews with members of the community. Think about research in terms of what you know about your students and what will work best for your class. After students research, they take what was learned and present the information using a presentation software or their completed research guide. The research activities are meant to be completed as a partner pair, small group, or even as a whole group if needed. Research is an action word in the Action Dictionary. Look through these adaptations and use the ones that would best support your students during the activities on the second page. The lesson supports available on page 2 are the research guide and the interview form. The research guide is leveled to support students. Choose the level that best supports each student's need. The research guide is meant to support students in researching a place, people and things in their community. Each lesson identifies the place that students are asked to research. In this example, students are researching the grocery store. As students complete their research, they record 3 facts on their research guide. The research guide is then used to create a presentation to show and tell others what they learned. Transition soft skills highlighted on page 2 are research, collaborate with others, learning about the people and places in their community. Each lesson has the option of interviewing 2 workers that are commonly found within the theme of the lesson. The interview form is leveled to support students as well. The purpose of the interview form is to give students the opportunity to learn about the jobs in their community. Students can use the interview as an additional piece of research. In addition to the research guide and interview forms, students are given a leveled fact page to organize the information they have gathered and plan their presentation. So students use the pick symbols or actual pictures to complete the facts pages. The facts they choose are the ones that they will include when presenting their information. When completing the fact summary pages, consider presenting choices to support students. Depending on students' writing, pick symbols or actual pictures can be used to complete the facts pages. An important part of collecting research is presenting findings. In every lesson, students have the opportunity to use their completed facts pages and present the information they collect to the class. How the presentations are completed will be dependent on each individual student. It may also be a slideshow software or showing their completed fact page. Pulling this all together now within the context of the lesson activities, the first part of page 2 is called Research and Share. It is made of 3 activities. During What Can We Do?, the theme poster and research guide are used to provide a context for where the lesson objective can be used or found. The research guide is used to identify words or places that can be researched on the internet. So for example, as the students look at their research guide, we can ask if they know the name of a grocery store by providing choices, or we can search for grocery stores near our school. We can use the picture of fruit and vegetables and ask about what favorite fruit might be, and then look up prices of that fruit at different stores. During Gather Information, students learn about the different ways that they can research. The numbered options show 3 different ways to research. You can choose just 1 or 2 based on your class need, or all 3 if possible. As a reminder, these options show students the different tools that can be used to research, so internet, books, and even a community visit. During Create and Share, students show their class what was learned through research. So students can use the photos they took during their research, presentation slides with digital photos they found on the internet, or even the research guide to show what they learned about the lesson objective and how it's connected to the theme. After students have presented, you can connect their research to the lesson objective by asking the bulleted questions. Every lesson asks the questions if this is a location that they would like to work at, and to identify a worker they saw in that location. During this lesson, we are discussing comparing prices. So students may be researching how to locate prices within the grocery store and who they might ask for help. The final step of research is to go back to the student's I Can page to fill out what has been learned during their research. At this point, you may need more space to record what has been learned, so know that the I Can page can always be flipped to accommodate more space. The last part of page 2 is learning links. The 3 activities are Home Link, Community Link, and Game. Home Link is a suggested activity for parents to complete with their student at home to reinforce the lesson objective. In this lesson, parents are working with their student at home to look through local grocery store ads to identify items that might be on their family grocery list. During Community Link, this is an activity to be completed in the classroom that connects the lesson objective back to the community. The games are newly written and are meant to reinforce a portion of the transition objective. To know the directions and materials needed, read through the game directions. If there are game-specific print materials needed, they will be included in the lesson-specific print materials from the members-only content. If there is a material from the equals kit, it will be listed consistent with how it is named within the equals lessons. For example, in this game, the purchase cards are used. The purchase cards are those that are found within your equals card box. As we move on to page 3, the supports available are the action cards, solve poster, role play problem solving page, and the leveled problem solving pages. On the third page, there are multiple opportunities for problem solving. You have solve it with role play discussion, independent problem solving, share and discuss. The materials used during these activities are familiar and provide a different opportunity to learn how to apply the transition objective to a problem solving lens. During the solve it with role play activity, students get an opportunity to live the problem they are solving. Students use familiar materials to act out how they would solve a problem as if they were the people in the problem. This really gives students that chance to use the action words and tools from that application lens. The role play problem solving page is used along with the action cards to provide a scenario to practice the strategies using the familiar tools. Change out names and incorporate additional tools and props as needed. Independent problem solving is next. This activity should feel relatively familiar to students as the structure is the same as found in the equals lessons. As with all the problem solving activities, begin by introducing the materials, the solve poster, and reading the problem aloud. Read the top paragraph to know the materials that will be out on the table. Notice it states to review the solve poster steps as needed to support students. The problem is written in italic font consistent with the equals math lessons. Looking at the levels now, choose the level that best supports each student. The strategies used in the lesson are listed in the level descriptions. Students will use the materials and the strategies to solve the problem. The first strategy is to place the largest price above the number line and the two smallest prices below the number line. Differences are counted and identifying the smallest price with the largest difference. Strategy 2 is to compare all prices one-to-one lined up in rows. Count differences, identify the smallest price with the largest difference. As with the equals problem solving worksheet, it is meant to be provided as a recording opportunity for the student to show their solution to the problem. Choose the level of worksheet that best supports each student when recording their solution to the problem. Share and discuss is another activity that should feel relatively familiar to students. This is an important opportunity to show one another how they solved a problem. Relevant and irrelevant facts are used to foster a discussion about how the solution may change if we changed a relevant fact or irrelevant fact. This is an important opportunity to practice and develop students' reasoning and proof skills. Be sure to spend some time discussing as well as acting out the different scenarios to see if it actually does change the solution. Closing out the lesson is next. The first activity is how did we learn? Students use the survey to mark how they felt about the activities during the lesson. This survey is used during the reflecting interview, in which you interview students and use their responses to help them identify their preferences and what they learned. This can also be an opportunity to practice their interviewing skills with someone they know and trust. The I can page that has been used throughout the entire lesson is now completed by students using the printed pick symbols to show what they have learned. One of the benefits of using the I can pages in each lesson is that they can be brought together to create an I can portfolio. This can then be brought to a student's transition meeting. These pages offer a student support to communicate the skills that they know how to do, the tools they know how to use, and the language they know. The research guide can also be used to identify potential jobs they may be interested in. Consider using these I Can pages to support student self-advocacy skills. As we conclude our webinar today, the first step is to identify the transition lesson you plan on starting with. Use one of the two spreadsheets we discussed today to locate your starting point. Once you know what lesson you plan on teaching, print the materials from your members-only content. Make sure to match the transition lesson identifier to the printed materials. Use the card spreadsheet we discussed to quickly identify those vocabulary and action cards that will be needed for the lesson. Use the materials box on the transition lessons to identify the materials that will be needed. As a reminder, there will be some overlap with equals materials. This was done purposefully as it allows students to generalize the skills they learned into a transition lens. Finally, read the entire lesson all the way through and identify the materials you will be using to get an idea of what your lesson may look like and the adaptations you may need to make with some of your students in mind. As you get started with the equals transition lessons and have questions, you can email the AbleNet customer service team at customerservice@ablenetinc.com or by calling one of the numbers on the screen. I'm excited for you to get started with the equals transition lessons. Thank you for joining us today.